As a mom, one of the most humbling experiences for me is realizing that if you're not part of the solution, you're part of the problem. So, what does that mean? We don't understand that when we rush in and fix them, that we get a temporary high off that. But sometimes that thing we're doing for them is actually harmful.
Welcome to the Holderman Homes podcast. I'm your host, Raven Holderman, where we talk heaven, health, and home. All right, guys, we're back. And today I have for you Dawn Ward. She is an author of From Guilt to Grace, Hope and Healing for Christian Moms of Addicted Children. She's also a biblical coach, and she is the founder of the Faith to Flourish, which is a ministry that equips women with addicted loved ones to break free from the cycle of addiction, reclaim their lives, and flourish in their faith. The Faith to Flourish also offers life transformation, insight, wisdom, and Christian guidance for all women, along with hope and support to those who feel burdened and overwhelmed by life. I really like that. I think that's a good place to start. So, if you really like what you heard last week and you want to keep hearing these interesting conversations, go ahead and hit subscribe to the Holderman Homes podcast, follow, leave us a review. I'm really excited to go ahead and jump into this. So, Dawn, hi. Happy to have you
Hey,
here.
hi, thanks so much for having me, Raven. I'm really excited to be here.
I'm just going to jump in with my first question because today's video is all about moms, specifically Christian moms, kind of reclaiming their identity after struggling with children who have their own addiction issues. It's that guilt or that misplaced identity in your children's troubles when what your children are going through is so, because we as moms totally attach ourselves to our kids. Like we're built to, really, truly. You have to be able to wake up to the cry, right? So every cry, even when they're adult, it's like you feel that. So the first question I just have to ask is, how did you get started in the parent, more specifically mom, support?
Okay. Well, thank you for asking that question. And that is such a long road. That was such a long road to get to that place. I didn't wake up one day and think, oh, I really want to start this ministry. And it's going to be all about ministering to moms and families and wives or parents of someone struggling with addiction. As a matter of fact, to be honest with you, to me, addiction is just this really ugly, scary, dark thing. And and so it's not something that we sign up for and say,
Yeah.
I'm going to go into this field. People who go into the field of ministry or addiction therapy or whatever really must feel a calling to do so. And my situation wasn't any different. If I were to look back on my life, every man in my life that I loved, that I cared for, that had strong influence in my life struggled with addiction to some substance in one form or another. So growing up, I grew up in a home where my father struggled with alcohol. My brother, believe it or not, has a serious food addiction and at one point weighed almost 900 pounds. My sister even struggled with an eating disorder. I later found out after my mom passed away that she was also struggling with gambling. Think of that as that dynamic. I'm the
Right.
oldest child in this family. And at different phases, everyone is struggling with some sort of a behavioral or substance addiction. So now, when I get into my family and start raising my own children, I'm going to do all the preventative measures to make sure this doesn't happen to them. And from making sure they eat healthy foods to hanging out with the right friends to going to Christian school when I could send them, Christian church, those type of things. Really warning them about the dangers of alcohol because in my family, my uncles, grandparents, grandfathers, they all struggled with it. So seeing that, I grew up thinking, gosh, I'm going to do everything I can to prevent it from happening in my family. And so, kind of warning them of the dangers and all of that. But I just really, it wasn't on my radar that one of them would get involved in drugs. Like I just never even saw that. I was never around drugs. I was pretty naive to it. So it wasn't on my radar, especially because my kids had been doing so well in school. My oldest son had already graduated from high school and was in college. And it was his younger brother who was the one who first had the problem. And what happened there was he'd been, I think, very sheltered. And it might have just been that we assumed that he would be more careful or that he would know the warning signs. And he was he was into sports and all of that, but his grades kind of started slipping. He wasn't interested in the same things he used to be interested in. And we noticed, his hair, his hygiene was changing too. And I think the first thing I found out, I caught him smoking. And I thought, my kid is smoking, this athlete, and he's in his final year of high school, wants to go to college. What's going on? But he was also playing in a garage band, and he was a musician, and he was in all the activities in school and everything. I think that's where he got to thinking, I'm smoking, started experimenting and playing with marijuana, so he thought. But one thing I always caution parents is that street drugs are not just marijuana. There's always other things in them, and those things are generally addictive. And that's the whole plan, that's the whole agenda of the people on the streets that are the bad guys on the streets that are selling drugs to minors, is to get
Yeah.
them addicted to something. So this was probably, gosh, close to maybe 18, 19 years ago. And so he was the one who finally, after I would drill him and question him and try to figure it out, finally he came and said, look, I want to go to college. I want to get my act together, and I'm in trouble. I cannot get off of whatever this is. So we did get him counseling and get him into Christian counseling, get some medical help, assistance, and all that. And he was on board to make a quick shift in his life. Now, it didn't mean it was easy and overnight, but ultimately, when he graduated from high school, he went away. He went out of state, got away from the friends and the influence, and was able to kind of further his education and all that before eventually moving home and getting his college degree. And so in that case, we kind of thought we dodged a bullet, because even though I was terrified and scared and all of this, things went according to plan, if you want to call it that, with him. But what happened was, about a year or so later, his older brother, who had had a lifetime of stomach issues, had a surgery, and they prescribed him opiates during that time when they would say that they weren't addictive. So that was kind of
Right.
a medically induced addiction, if you want to call it that, where millions of people became addicted to substances that they had no idea had such highly addictive properties. And
Mm.
so it's very good for people to understand that not everyone who gets addicted is hanging out with the wrong crowd or lives in a certain demographic. It can happen to anyone. And nowadays, those drugs are also much more dangerous than even the ones that he was exposed to, because the fentanyl and the different things that are on the street today. But this being about, this was probably about 15 years ago or so that this happened with my oldest son. I just rushed him back to the doctor and said, what's wrong? We can't get him off these medicines and things. And that's when she told me, he's now addicted to this. Well, the reason I tell you this story is because his situation was much more complicated. He struggled with depression. He struggled with anxiety. He had some forms of almost like an agoraphobia because his stomach problems had caused him
Mm.
so many issues. So when he took these drugs, these opiates, it made him feel better inside and out. And then he jumped into the, treatment side of things and was prescribed mental health drugs and anti-anxiety medications and the different things. And while I think for a certain group of people there that is truly necessary, it can be an easy go-to. That's not the solution to that problem. So I'm not
Yeah.
saying that he doesn't need certain mental health drugs that he's on right now, because he was diagnosed with bipolar, but there was a lot of other ones, very addictive drugs like Xanax, that were prescribed to him, and those are very dangerous drugs, the benzodiazepines. So I just let people know that.
So he started on a dangerous drug, and then the doctors gave him more dangerous drugs to try and get him off the original dangerous drug. Okay.
And then that threw him into psychosis, and we just had more situations. Really, that that was so much more of what you would hear of as this spiraling downward that addiction takes people into. And when that happens, of course, mommy is doing everything she can, just like she would, if he was a little baby, to save him. Like, so naturally, when you see a child who is, in their early 20s, they're still your child, and you're doing everything you can to either rescue them, prevent them from getting hurt, whatever it is. I think growing up in the environment that I grew up in, where I had way too much responsibility put on me, too many, uh, I think codependency and enabling probably developed back then. And then they became a go to response when I was put into this situation that was out of control. So that's where I got to the place where, God had to work on me. And then we get into the story of how the actual ministry started. I came to a place one day where my husband said, "You're going to worry yourself to death." And it was like an aha moment for me because I profess to be a Christian, to love the Lord, to trust Him with my children. But I was really spinning out of control. When I wasn't working, I was 100% all in to saving him. Whatever it was, I was all into it. And while I was telling myself I trusted God, I was getting more and more enmeshed in this toxic behavior.
I like what you said before, though, like where it's like you have to confront that part of yourself that is codependent.
Hmm.
So it's you have this codependency from childhood, and you have to confront the codependency, especially as moms, we're pretty inclined to, I think, with our children specifically. And you have to figure out how to navigate getting past that and be your
Yes.
own person. But especially when you have a child who's going through something like very serious addiction, that's got
Yeah.
to be a very tough break almost within
Hmm.
yourself to say, I have to stop being codependent on my
Right.
troubled child.
Right. That was what happened with me was when my husband said that to me, I would say that 24/7, it didn't matter day or night, I could hear the words playing in my head, "You have to fix your son. You have to fix your son. You have to fix your son." It was like a broken record and it was stuck. And so it would be like if you were driving and you had the music playing in the background real quietly in your car, but you could hear it. You're still having conversations, still doing everything else, but your brain was fixated on that music. My brain was fixated, and it gave me a lot of empathy for people who do struggle with true mental issues and just sometimes just the level of stress that we can get under. And so while all outward appearances I was functioning, I could tell inside my brain that that was not okay. So when my husband said that thing to me, I had said, "It's okay. You can put she worried herself to death on my tombstone." And I saw the word "she worried herself to death" on my headstone. And then the Lord said, "No, I wanted to say she trusted God." So that was a real aha moment for me because I was being confronted by God Himself to say, "Do you trust me? And if I'm going to say I trust you, then what does that look like?" And for me, what that meant was if I can trust him when I get in a car and I drive myself across town, knowing I could get in an accident, if I trust him knowing that, one of my other children could go out and drive their car and get in an accident, or my husband, if I can trust him with this, why is it that addiction screams louder and demands more attention? Because my child is living recklessly and they are self destructing. But I only have so much control in that. And I had to realize the amount of control I have in that situation is no more than if my husband gets in the car and drives across town without me in there. So it was a challenge for me to say, what does it look like to let go, and disengage from the daily drama, but still be actively involved and still participate in what's going on here. So for me, it had to be that I started to ask, what's in it for me? And this sounds really kind of crazy, but often I was motivated by my own fear, my own worry, and I wanted relief from those negative feelings. And I had to learn that that was not always the best response in a situation. But because I wanted to relieve my own pain, my own angst, I would do a certain behavior. It might be something as simple as sending him a text message or picking up the phone to check on him. But really, was it benefiting him for me to do that, or was it benefiting me to do that?
I like how you said that the disengaging from the drama, because we can feed off of that without even intentionally doing so. But it also goes on the flip side. So it's like if we're feeding off the drama, then we're feeding into the drama, and then they're feeding off the drama. It's that idea of we're feeding it with negative attention, even though it's
Right.
not like a positive thing. They're still getting the attention from a negative point, but like it's still feeding it.
As a mom, one of the most humbling experiences for me as we talk about our identity and why God brought me into the ministry and everything is realizing that if you're not part of the solution, you're part of the problem. So what does that mean? Because I'm the mom, I'm not going to quit loving him. I'm not going to quit being concerned about his safety. I'm not going to quit believing in him and believing the best for him. I had to spend a lot of time in prayer. I had to spend a lot of time in God's word. I had to spend a lot of time getting used to being uncomfortable in my own skin And by doing so, it's almost like if you were being exposed to, if you were afraid of heights and
Mm.
you're not going to go jump out of a plane the first day, right? But you may go onto a little tiny bridge at the kiddies playground and just go over that and just or go up a couple rungs of a ladder and just get yourself used to that feeling of being up. There's things that we do that are almost like an exposure therapy. Well, it's the same thing for us as moms, is that we don't understand that when we rush in and fix them or rush in and put a fire out of that situation, bail them out of jail, give them money, whatever it is, that we get a temporary high off that because we're doing what's a mama thing, and it comes naturally to us and it feels good to do that thing for them. But sometimes that thing we're doing for them is actually harmful. And that's what I mean by not being part of the solution, but being part of the problem. So if I'm not giving you money, I might be uncomfortable. I might have to sit in that if he says things to me that are unkind, retaliates and says, I hate you or whatever it is, I have to be able to be uncomfortable and accept that feeling and give it to God and rest in it, knowing that, I will heal. I will start to get better. I will start to get stronger. And so those were some of the things that I had to start to do. And another big thing I had to start doing was take the time and energy that I was putting into researching help for him and put it into finding help and support for myself. Because with moms, they often won't even spend a penny on themselves. They will not get their own counseling if it means that they might have to take money that they would be giving to their addicted child. That's how bad the level of and how intense the level of codependency can get, where we are really, really in a very toxic relationship, but don't
Hmm.
even know it because we think we're helping. So I had to get used to being a little selfish and doing some things, allowing God to work in my life, help me with my identity separate from that of being a mom, but being a daughter of God, being a child of God, and understanding He has a plan and purpose for me that can move forward even if my child doesn't get better. And so those were some of the challenges I faced when I was making that transition to where God was like, okay, now I want you to start working with other women.
So when you're in that transition and you're going through this process, you're disengaging from the drama, you're trying to say no in healthy ways, you're building up these boundaries, you're sitting in the uncomfortable, which is a
Yes.
great idea. I like how you said that, which also allows them an opportunity they may have been denied that they need.
Hmm.
But again, going through this process, what practical practices did you start to use to change the negative mindset that you were in?
One of the best pieces of advice I got from a Christian counselor that I was working at the time was to fast time away from my child or thinking about my child or doing something about with my child. That would even mean perhaps blocking the phone or turning the phone off at night so I could get some rest. And at first that's really hard, because we're thinking, what if there's an emergency? But I just remember him saying, if there's an emergency, they will find you. They will get a hold of you. In most cases, there's a way for them to reach you, whether it's calling another family member or whatever. So he would say, even if you just go for a walk, leave your phone at home or turn it on silent and just take that hour. Spend time reflecting, spend time just doing something for yourself that is apart from your your addicted child. Now remember, I had two other children. My husband also became addicted to pain medications after 5 multiple back surgeries and fusions, and also became addicted to gambling. So I was dealing with it from all sides. And so self-care and soul care was critical, but we don't know how to do it without constantly checking our phone. We have our devices always attached to us to see if they're calling, to see if they're trying to reach us. For me, the first steps were things like having my quiet time and not having my phone near me, or turning my phone off for an hour to go for a walk, or eventually keeping my phone on silent while I slept at night. I did things like turn off ringers and things, which sounds crazy, but for me, those were triggers. So if I heard the phone ring, it would trigger me. So I needed to be more mindful. I turned off certain notifications on my phone so that I knew that only certain notifications would come through so that I didn't see something and panic every time.
So you're literally turning off trigger points.
Yes, yes.
I like that.
And not everybody necessarily needs to do all of that, but for me, I didn't recover well after triggered. It took a while
Mm.
for me to come back down because I was such a fixer. I'd grown up in an environment where my parents would call me and tell me to fix the family, like to fix my siblings, and because I was the oldest, I was responsible for them. And so these behaviors and mindsets carried into adulthood. And God was like, okay, now you're in this situation with your children, but these are still triggers from your childhood. It wasn't so much avoidance as it was learning to kind of control some triggers that you can control. You can't control them all, but you also don't need to be exposed to constant triggers all day long either. It was a matter of me just being mindful of what things did trigger me, and then could I kind of scale back on those a little bit. And so self-awareness is so important. Also, if
Preach.
I yeah, and also if I found that there was just a negative message playing over and over in my head, I would either have a positive affirmation to remind myself of the truth, because I don't want to say something that's not true, because I am a Bible believing Christian and I believe you speak the truth. And the Bible tells us to be renewed in our minds, and to not conform to the pattern of this world and how they think, but to be renewed in our mind. And we do that through learning the Bible, learning what God has to say about things. And that had a lot to do with when I got into the ministry, was that the Lord took me on a deep dive into the Bible and what it says about addiction and bondage and life controlling behaviors and idolatry and all those things. I came out with a lot more hope because I realized how much God loves my child, and that helped me to have those periods where I didn't feel like I had to get involved all the time, or I had to play God in his life and be as conscious for him, but I could trust that he knew I loved him, that he knew I was there for him. I'm always speaking words of affirmation to him. But at the same time, there was just times when the Lord was like, you just need to be quiet and just not say a thing at all. Just be quiet.
Just jumping in here real quick to tell you about today's sponsor, which is actually Riverside, which is where I record these podcasts. If you are interested in recording a podcast, I cannot suggest Riverside more. I'll have a link in the description for you. They're so great, guys. They do video, they do audio, they upload locally to get the best quality picture. It's really easy. It's really user-friendly. Go with Riverside every time. When you are speaking that kind of positivity into yourself, it will actually feed the positivity back into the situation. And I think that's something that, again, we have to be very conscious of, because if we are always coming from a negative mindset, then we're not really feeding into anyone. We have to be coming from a positive place within ourselves, where at least we're comfortable with who we are. At least we know in truth, as you said, who we are and where we stand and how we stand with God. Otherwise, anything that we're feeding back into the world is going to have this dirty imprint on it almost.
Right.
Because we've allowed ourselves and our soul and the way that we speak into the world to become tainted by the problem, rather than focusing on the solution, which is God and the word that he gives us, the truth that he
Right.
gives us,
That's
and
right.
the freedom that he gives us. And when you have experienced freedom in Christ, then, and really only then, can your children start to feel that weight lifted as well. Because then you can feed the freedom that you felt in Christ equally into them.
Mm-hmm. That's right.
As they are willing to accept it, of course, but you can't give something to them that you've never experienced. So you have to choose to experience it for yourself first. It is that you have to put yourself
Right.
first, just enough, at least just enough,
You do.
to be able to feed into other people.
You're so right about that. And I just was thinking of the verse that says, as a man thinks in his heart, so he is. What that tells me is that whatever we believe and whatever's in there is what's going to come out.
Yes.
And so that transformation has to take place in our heart, in our
Yes.
soul. Like our minds, yes, we want to renew our minds, but also we have to see ourselves through God's eyes and have that heartfelt awareness of who we are in him.
I agree.
And yeah, and I feel like sometimes that gets stolen from us, it's like all the weeds in life. And because of our emotions, and because maybe we're anxious by nature, or maybe things have happened, we've experienced trauma, we don't feel loved, right? We don't feel chosen. We don't feel seen. We don't feel heard. But the truth is we are. But because our emotions are so tangled up we're trying to sort out the truth, and we want to feel better. And one of the things God showed me is that when we go after substances or behaviors, or moms enable or rescue their kids or whatever they do, we're usually either pursuing pleasure or fleeing pain. And that's why I was talking about being uncomfortable. It's not that forever you're going to be uncomfortable, but in the beginning, you're going to feel like a square peg in a round hole. But as you start to step out in faith and do the things God's telling you to do and just be obedient, it's going to get more comfortable. And then you're going to be acting more out of faith than fear. And they're going to start to feel better too. Like, it's not always going to be so hard.
Exactly.
It's going to get not easier, but you're going to get more comfortable with some of the decisions and choices you make.
Yeah, you don't live in the uncomfort forever, but you have to live
Right.
there for a while.
Right. Kind of like when you go to the gym, and you're working out in the beginning and it's just killing you. It's tough. It's tough. I started, when I circle back around to when you asked about starting it, it was probably about 10 years ago. The Lord gave me a vision for a ministry, but I didn't know it was addiction related. And I'm like, I'm all in, God, anything but addiction. And he kind of went radio silent on me. And I was like, oh, addiction. And what I realized was I felt so I felt so inadequate. I felt so unprepared. I felt like, find somebody who's way farther ahead in the game than I am. And he was like, no, we're going to start a Facebook group and you're going to go in there. And I'm like, there's plenty of Facebook groups. And so the Facebook group, Christian Moms of Addicted Children, actually came before the Ministry of the Faith to Flourish. And the Ministry of the Faith to Flourish came when I started blogging and started kind of writing more about our family story, which came shortly after the group. But the group for me was very eye-opening. It helped me so much because I didn't know what I was going to do in there. And the Lord just said, pray for your children, encourage the moms, and glorify me. And so I went in with no real agenda other than just to be there as a group to encourage each other and to glorify God. And so through that observation of watching all these women in here in that group work through that process of learning how to, some come in and they're just so new and they're so panicked and they're scared to death, and how the others just gather around them and encourage them and give them hope. Out of that, the ministry continued to grow and eventually became a book for me of what God had taught me through my deep dive into the scriptures, and then through my personal experience, and then through my observation of other moms going through it.
Talking about the group is a good jumping off point for my next question, which is, how do you advise combating grief and denial for moms struggling to let go?
Okay, so there is a story in my book about a situation where God had to reveal to me through a dream a blind spot. Actually, there was a lot of blind spots, and I had to have somebody point them out. So in the dream, I had I had redecorated my home. It was gorgeous, beautiful. But ultimately, when I was showing the room off to my friends, one brave soul said, well, what are you going to do with that? And she pointed to this dilapidated chair that used to be white, had, at one point, beautifully overstuffed chair. Now, most of the fabric was gone or stained and the wood was splintered. And I didn't even see the chair. I had literally decorated the entire room around it. And I even said to her, what chair are you talking about? And she said, well, that chair. And then the chair came into light and I saw it. Then, of course, I would wake up from my dream. And this had gone on numerous times. So finally, one time I asked the Lord the meaning of the chair. And he said, the chair is the lies, the false beliefs, the things that you believe that are not true about yourself, about others, and about your relationship with me, but you can't see them. And so at that point, I had to start working through the process of God revealing what those blind spots were. And the ones that were critical back then were those lies of me believing that all this was on me. It was on me to keep my family happy, to keep my family healthy, to keep my children safe, that it was my fault that, and maybe my family genes or whatever, that they had decided to use drugs in the first place. All that I was carrying was the weight of the world on my shoulders, that it was either my fault or my job to fix it. So I know in the 12 steps, they'll say you didn't cause it, you can't control it, and you can't cure it. They've got the 3 C's. But for me, this was really God saying, I want to get to the heart of those beliefs. Not just that you believe them and not just making you aware that you believe them, but why do you believe them? And so much of it had to do with how I saw myself. We talk about our identity. Our identity can be found in whose we are, or can be found in who we are and what we do. And I believe that my perfectionism and my need to be accomplished and my need to be all things to all people and ultimately people pleasing was a result of just a poor self image and not knowing who I was in Christ. So for some moms, they might go through this experience and it might not hit them quite as hard as it did me. I would imagine for all moms, the pain is equally as deep because, and especially if they've lost a child to addiction. But for me, it was also a belief system that needed to shift, that needed to realize I wasn't as important as I thought I was. It was very humbling for me to realize that, to say, you are God, I am not God. And this identity that I built is all about my performance, and I cannot live up to my own standards. The only person who could live up to these standards is God Himself. But the world can do that to us, and we can also do it to ourselves with our own upbringing and everything. It really was about shifting my identity and seeing how loved I was by God. And that even the people around me loved me and didn't expect me to be perfect, that my own standards were higher than theirs. And that helped my identity shift a lot so that I could accept my own failures, my own shortcomings, my own limitations. That is what I am hoping to share with moms who are going through this guilt, because along the way, not only are they going to feel overwhelming guilt, self blame, shame, they're probably going to be going through some deep grief over what could have been, what might be. So, the past and wishing that things were different for their children, but then that fear that they might possibly lose them. Also, the loss of that, just the relationship as they had hoped it would be. So, that kind of a grief they have to process through. In my case, grit of trying just to do so much on my own that I worked myself into sheer exhaustion. And then God's grace. Well, maybe for somebody else, God's grace, they might have accepted and received God's grace a little bit earlier in the journey. For me, I kind of was at the end of my rope. God's grace was always there, but I was the one who had to work through the process of receiving that grace, no strings attached.
Okay. Moving right along here. How can a Christian mom start to realign her identity in Christ, not her addiction afflicted children, which is kind of what you were already jumping into?
I would say getting good, strong support, but not just addiction support, good Christian support. Get someone who's willing to mentor, disciple you. I know I'm called a biblical life coach, but really I'm a Bible teacher and mentor, and I love to disciple sisters in the Lord, especially women that are younger than me, and just remind them of who they are in God and for them to see themselves through His eyes. And so it's important to have somebody speaking truth into your life. And maybe it's a more mature sister in the Lord who's already raised her kids. Maybe she's 10, 15 years older than you, and she can just help you walk through the process of just gleaning what the scriptures have to say and reminding you that, you're a mom. God loves you. He assigned you the job of being the mom to this child who's struggling right now. And then also getting support from other moms who've gone through the situation and understand, or wives, or whatever whoever your audience is, whoever their addicted loved one is, but going through that also so that you have somebody that when you talk about it, they can relate. Support is the most important thing because we can really get stuck in our own heads. And a lot of the thoughts that go on in our heads can really cause us to act out of character, say things we don't mean, have short tempers, respond by neglecting the rest of the family. Whether it could be something like you need to go to your child's school play and you go, your other's child, but you're not there. You're not attached. You're not engaged. You're not enjoying it because your mind is obsessing over your addicted child, or they're blowing up your phone while you're at the play or at the sports activity or whatever. So sometimes having people around you that just say, hey, mom, it's okay. Just take that hour break. It's going to take care of itself. God's got His hand on this. You go enjoy the game. And we have to give ourselves permission to do those things. And so in the very beginning, support is critical.
Just to recap there, what I'm hearing is a couple of things. First is truth with kindness, because you really can't separate the two, especially when you're going through something that's so heavy. You have to have truth, you have to have the foundation, but you have to deliver it in such a way that you're being kind to yourself. You're giving grace to yourself. Like, you're not going to fix it in a day. You're not going to fix the negative mindset in a day. You're not going to escape the pattern that you've been in a short window, a week. Like, it's going to take some time. It's going to take some support. It's going to take calling out your blind spots from people who you trust so that way you
Yes.
can work through them. It's going to take having boundaries, some stronger boundaries for yourself.
Yes.
That can be really hard, but I really like personally to talk about boundaries, especially for ourselves, because they are rather life-giving, actually.
Hmm.
And so just recapping, that's what I'm really taking away from what you're talking about is, these important ideas of community, support, truth, kindness, boundaries. Like, you have to have a little bit of it all, and you have to be willing to do the work to get there.
Yes. And early on, moms, a lot of times they're younger, they haven't gone through this for a long time, they haven't exhausted all their efforts. And so I know that I was probably a little bit over halfway into self-destructing. Like I hadn't gone completely down, but the warning signs were there. But I could get up and I could go to work and I could keep a clean house and I could do certain things. I think that was a resilience that's built into me. Another mom might find that she's really not managing it physically well, emotionally well, and it's okay because she may be much more sensitive. She might her own personality could be softer and has a hard time dealing with confrontation. See, one isn't right and one isn't wrong. It's a matter of recognizing what's going on in you.
The self-awareness.
I don't think my level of resilience was necessarily playing in my favor.
Right? Because
Yeah,
that's interesting.
I described that in the book, some situations that I went through where God kind of challenged me. Like, you think you're doing pretty good here, but he actually was saying it would have been more appropriate for you to have gone and, gotten help or whatever than to have kept continued to work. I realized I was locked into flight, fight, or freeze. Well, I operate in freeze where I shut down my emotions and I can continue to operate. But there's times when we have to feel the emotion and say,
Yeah.
this isn't okay, and I'm going to go home and have a good cry, or I'm going to go home and get a hold of my husband so we can be together while this thing is going on. But I was so resilient that I was freezing and operating in a place that was not good and was not healthy, in this heightened state of adrenal rush and cortisol and all of this. And my reason for saying that is that I think the sooner that you start getting support, you become more aware of how your body handles stress, how your body handles the heightened, when you get these calls in the middle of the night, and how quickly you can recover and come back down from them is really critical. Because if you don't recover and then you get hit with another and then you get hit with another, and then a mom wonders why she's in the hospital and is having heart palpitations and thinks that she's having a heart attack, and very well might be, or has developed certain illnesses and things, and it's all because of how we're handling all the
Mm-hmm.
stress that we're going through.
That's how bitterness and resentment build in people, is
Yes.
that they're holding on tightly without
Yes.
really knowing it or acknowledging it, these things. And it just becomes this monstrous problem.
Hmm. And that's why I recommend that you have somebody, some sort of a mentor or a good friend, somebody who knows you that can say, sweetheart, I'm really concerned. I'm seeing this. Are you aware? And so you have those people that are helping support you with the addiction, but you also have somebody who really cares about you, that's speaking truth into your life and looking out for your health and well-being as well. And you have to let them do it. We have to be so
Yes.
humble to say, okay, like the woman who pointed out the white chair in my dream, and I could have argued with her day in and day out that the white chair wasn't there, but the reality is that when she pointed it out and the Holy Spirit said, there it is, I had to deal with it. So that, a trust is a big deal. And we tend to not trust when we're going through these painful things. We don't trust ourselves. We don't trust others.
Mm-hmm.
It's a real scary time.
I like that little part though that you mentioned of we have to deal with it, because there's lots of people out there who are runners.
Yes.
They see the problem and they're running from the problem. And
Hmm.
actually, sometimes those can be the most difficult people to help and deal with, because
Yes.
it's like you can try and confront with them all day long, even especially with kindness. If they're a runner, please use kindness. If they're not ready to hear what you have to say,
That's right.
it's really not going to matter. And that can be
It
the
isn't.
toughest thing of all.
Because sometimes you speak truth and they're not ready, but then maybe
Right?
down the road it will start to be something. And so don't bombard them. Like, these mothers are
No.
exhausted. Really, for anybody who's listening and supporting somebody or cares about somebody who's in the boat that I was in as a mother. If you see something, don't sweat the small stuff, but really just address her heart, address her health, not telling her so much what to do or how to take care of the situation with her
Yeah.
kid, but just be her friend and just be a good listener like you would with any mom who is going through. And I understand she is grieving, so it's, she's grieving a child who's still alive, but she is grieving, and sometimes just needs to talk to somebody, but doesn't actually need bombarded with a lot of advice, but just a good listening ear. And that takes, it just, we're not going to do it perfectly. As friends, we're not
No.
going to do it perfectly. God's not so much concerned about my opinion as he is my heart. He wants me just to love on them. So for the moms that maybe aren't quite ready, I know what that feels like. I've walked into those meetings before and just wanted to make a run out the door. And then I would say, if that's not for you, and maybe you try another one and still it's just too much, it's too overwhelming, find that good Christian counselor. Find that person who is a good listener who can take their time with you and help you process it, because maybe all those stories and things are too much. And
I
they
agree.
they affected my faith. I would leave terrified. So I didn't find 12-step meetings for me personally, at least in the beginning, to be super helpful, because I was operating already in such a place of fear. That's how I had been raised, what I grew up with. So it just heightened it for me. Now, some people love them and they do well with them. So for me, one-on-one counseling was much more helpful.
All right. Well, I'm going to give you a chance to give any last advice or encouragement for mothers who are walking through this that feel like they're failing.
My encouragement to these moms is not to let their child's behavior or their child's response to their behavior be the defining final say of who they see themselves as. You are the perfect mom. God gave you the responsibility of having this child. He will give you the wisdom. He will tell you how to pray. He will show you what to do as you trust him, because he knows that you're the mom for the job. And that is one thing I encourage moms with all the time is, I'm not going to tell you how to raise your child. I'm not going to tell you how to relate to your child. God knows your child's heart and he knows your heart, and he will lead you and he will guide you. So just be comforted in knowing that he loves them so much and he loves you so much. And he's not leaving you out there on your own to do this. He promises he'll never leave you or forsake you. He promises he'll give you wisdom when you ask for it. So trust him and trust your heart and trust as a mom that you know the heart of your child, and that God will speak into your life and show you how to help them and how to be an encouragement to them through this, and how to set those healthy boundaries, mom, because you do need to do that.
Yep. You got to agree there. You really do.
Yeah.
So, Dawn, thank you for coming on
Thank
today.
you.
I will leave a link to your website in the description. For any moms out there who really enjoyed this conversation, please follow and subscribe, leave a review, and we can get more content out there like this for you. I want to continue to post content like this because I want to continue to encourage you. These struggles don't define you. We're not stuck there. So I'm going to close with a verse, Hebrews 4:16.
Yes.
So let us come boldly to the throne of our gracious God. There we will receive his mercy and we will find grace to help us when we need it most. So that's all I
Amen.
have for you guys today. And thank you again, Dawn.